student from Ukraine, you mean, or Russia? We can give them a chance to
Just
speak.
curious, yeah.
You can ask now.
All right, well, welcome everyone. I am Dr. Krista Wiegand. I'm an associate professor in the Department of Political Science. And in my capacity here, I am the director of the Global Security Program here at the Baker Center for Public Policy. So I'm delighted to welcome all of you to this panel on an unfortunate topic, of course, the crisis in Russia and Ukraine. I will make introductions shortly, but before I do that, I want to note that we actually have several similar events coming up here at the Baker Center. We have 2 next week. There are flyers out on the table you can grab on your way out of the door. Next week on the 7th, we have Ken Weinstein, who will be speaking on the Asia policy challenges for the Biden administration, and that's from 5 to 6 p.m. here, March 7th in the Toyota Auditorium. It will also be broadcast live on the internet. And then 2 days later, on March 9th, from 12 to 1, we will have our virtual Baker Cafe with John Rader, who's a UT alum, and that will only be virtual. You can tune in on our website. And he will be looking at assessing the Biden administration's first year in foreign policy. He worked in the National Security Council part at the White House under the Trump administration, so he has a lot of insight. So let me go ahead and introduce my my colleagues. And for those of you who are tuning in from online, you should have a link at the bottom of the screen, tiny.utk.edu/webcast questions. So please type in your questions. We will see them and have a student moderate those questions for us for the panelists. For those of you in the room, we're going to do brief comments about our insight into the crisis, and then we'll open it up for Q&A, which is the main point of this panel. Please try to keep your questions brief and rather than a commentary. We appreciate that. And if you have specific questions you can see our name placed here. If you want to address them to one of us specifically, that's fine. If it's anybody, we can just go ahead and answer them as we go along. So I will first introduce Dr. Wonjae Hwang, who's my colleague in the Department of Political Science, who's a political economist. And Dr. Catherine Luther is the director of the School of Journalism and Electronic Media. And then Dr. Tim Roberson is a Post-Doctoral Fellow here at the Baker Center in the Energy and Environment program. So we'll all be talking about different perspectives of the conflict. And I'll go ahead and start just to give you some geopolitical context of this conflict. There's a lot of speculation, of course, about the causes and the reasons why Vladimir Putin chose to invade Ukraine. And it may seem like this is something that came out of the blue, although intelligence reports, of course, showed for weeks the Biden administration released intelligence information on purpose to kind of take away the scare tactic for Russia. Everyone knew that this was coming a few weeks ago. But if you actually look back over the past couple years, and really not even a year, but more so last 3 or 4 or 5 years. If you actually put the pieces together, you can see that this was in the works to be planned for a long time. So this is not something that he just decided one day to do. And I think there's a lot of speculation that that Putin is power hungry. He claims that he's doing this for ethnic separatists. There are Russian separatists in Ukraine, and that is true. But it seems like there's been a lot of misinformation, which Dr. Lewis is going to talk about. But I want to give you the broad context of what's been happening between Russia and NATO and the U.S. For the last 30 years. And I know I'm not going to be able to speak, of course, about the last 30 years. But for those of you who are not students, you will recall the end of the Cold War was the end of the Soviet Union. And what that meant was it was the end of Russian power. And Russia has been humiliated, literally, for the last 30 years. And the first 10 years after the Cold War under Yeltsin, things were seemingly better. They were trying to integrate with the global economy, and they did to some degree. Putin came into power in 22 years ago, and since then, of course, it's been tenser and tenser between the West and Russia. And at the same time, Eastern European states have joined NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, which was designed initially to balance or counter Russian aggression. So you can see here, this is a conflict that's been simmering for definitely the last 20 years, if not 30 years. So even though the US is not in this war, I would consider this very much a proxy war, very much like the wars that were fought during the Cold War between 1945 and 1990. And the reason I say that is because NATO, even though it is a European-dominated alliance, it is led very much by the US, militarily, economically, politically, and so forth. And this is a rivalry between the US-led international system, we would call it, and Russia. And for the last 30 years, Russia's sphere of influence has declined drastically, to the point all the way to its border. So Ukraine is not a member of NATO, as you probably know from reading the news, but there were talks in the last couple of years about Ukraine joining NATO. Now, Latvia, Lithuania, and Estonia, the Baltic states right up against Russia as well, they have joined NATO. They are NATO members. So NATO, this alliance, is literally on Russia's doorstep. And so I would call this conflict a great power conflict. This is not unfortunately, this is not really about Ukraine. And I feel bad. I think all of us feel very bad for Ukraine and for the citizens of Ukraine. This morning there were 660,000 refugees already flowing into other Eastern European countries, and probably going into Western Europe as well. But I would say that Ukraine is very much a pawn in a bigger power politics game. This is a rivalry about the balance of power, meaning these alliances, Russia against the West or Russia against NATO and the US. Something else to keep in mind is this is the first major war, or the first war really, in a long time that has not involved humanitarian intervention, defending a country that was attacked, like when Iraq invaded Kuwait, the US and the coalition went in to fight, or an attack on a country from a state sponsor of a terrorist group, which was the Afghanistan war. Interestingly enough, the comparison that Putin himself made when he was declaring war on Wednesday morning, last Wednesday, he actually cited the U.S. invasion of Iraq as a comparison to overthrow their leader, and in the name saying there were just like we consider Saddam Hussein a threat, he considered Ukraine a threat. Now, we could go on and on to debate how realistic that really is, but what's important to note is that that is what Putin believes. He believes that Ukraine is a threat, or he at least is saying that, and Dr. Luther will address that more later on. And so this is really, the important point here is if you actually read his speech, and I actually have the English translation of his hour-long declaration of war, it's actually very logical. He's very clear about his intentions. He's very clear about his perception of what this war is about. And it is really, about very little about Ukraine. It is all about power and competition and rivalry and the sphere of influence for Russia, and making sure that everybody here knows in the West that Russia is back and they're not going anywhere. And I think this is a turning point. This is very much a turning point for the US, for Europe, as well as China. China is watching this very carefully, of course. And this is going to be something that we're going to be dealing with for quite a long time. I don't know how long the war will end, of course, or will last. No one really knows what the end game is. And how would Putin succeed? No one really knows what that would mean. I suspect that he will not be able to occupy Ukraine successfully on a long-term basis. What will probably happen realistically is Russia will annex chunks of Ukraine and break it apart so that, similar to East and West Germany or North and South Korea, there will probably be a pro-Russian part of Ukraine and a pro-Western part of Ukraine. Of course, he's going to try to remove Zelensky, the president of Ukraine, and who knows if he'll succeed. But having that buffer zone in Ukraine is very, very important. So as I said, a lot of this is not about Ukraine. It's just an unfortunate geostrategic location that happens to be next to Russia. All of this talk about Ukrainians being ethnically the same as Russians, that's very much a lot of propaganda. And yes, there's shared history, but we could say the same for those of us who have European ancestry in Europe. Are we the same people? Should we be part of the same country? No, of course not. So there's a lot of information going around there, but about the causes of this war. But I think that's kind of the brief overview of this conflict. So at this point, I don't want to go on any longer. I want to save time for my colleagues and for questions. So I will turn it over to Dr. Hwang. Yep.
Okay, thank you. So I was asked to talk about two things: what's going on in terms of economic sanctions on Russia, how big they are, and second, whether these sanctions are going to be effective in dissuading Russia from taking more aggressive actions or withdrawing their troops from Ukraine. So I'll talk about these two things briefly. But my simple answer to these first questions, is it big enough in terms of sanction size? Yes. At least it's bigger than the one we imposed in 2014 and afterward on Russia. The answer to the question, is it big enough to, it's going to be effective in dissuading Russia from taking aggressive actions? Probably not. This is not because the sanction size, the magnitude of these sanctions on Russia is not big enough, but because, as Krista mentioned, Russia may perceive it as a fundamental national security issue, then it'll be hard for us to just impose sanctions to dissuade Russia from taking these actions. Unless we take further steps other than economic sanction, it won't be effective. That's my simple answer. So then I want to go more in detail about my understanding about sanctions. So in general, why states utilize sanctions as a tool to force other countries to cooperate with others, and then what are the conditions of successful economic sanctions, and then finally I'll talk about the sanction imposed in Russia, whether they're going to be effective or not. So in terms of the general purpose of utilizing economic sanction for many states are two things. First, a sanction has been utilized as a tool to send information, signal information toward our target. Mostly sender like US want to send our information about our resolve, determination, complaint, dissatisfaction with their actions. But in many cases, according to previous research, actually sanction can signal different informations. Instead of signaling our strengths, actually we can signal our weakness and in decisiveness. Actually, according to the history of sanctions, 2/3 of sanction cases fail to achieve their policy goal. Only 1/3 cases we achieve the goal by imposing sanction. When it comes to the issues like in this case, military, preventing or stopping military action operations, our chances of getting the Paris goal by imposing sanctions is much reduced down to 20%. So if his target of sanction is not democracy like Russia, then it reduced down to less than 10%. So in general, according to previous report, our chances of drawing cooperation from Russia over Ukraine issues actually less than 10%. That's general. And also we cannot, actually Russia has taken our action of economic sanction as our weakness instead of our strength, because the reason why they take it, perceive it as our weakness, because we didn't say that we will take military options. They think that we're using economic sanction because we cannot take more aggressive military actions. That's why sanctions have failed. That's why the target can freely do whatever they do, because they know we cannot. According to, for example, a report from last week, about 70% of US citizens are against military engagement in Ukraine. Likewise, Russia has received a lot of this information from the US side that US has no intention to engage in Ukraine case militarily. So in that sense, by imposing economic sanction, actually we are sending informations of our weakness instead of our resolve or determinations. And the second reason why we utilize economic sanction is definitely we want to coerce our target to give it up and draw cooperation from them. So actually there are three main reasons according to previous studies. First, by imposing sanctions, we want to give damages on their national economy. That's first thing. Second, actually we want to target selective groups of people whose support are essential for political leaders, like Putin's leadership. So like members of winning coalitions we are targeting. That's one of the reasons why imposing economic sanctions. The last one is we want to destabilize their political leadership in Russia, like working on the public, so that the leaders lose his popularity from the people. So that's the third the reasons why impose economic sanctions. Then I will talk about the general conditions of successful economic sanctions. There are many four possible conditions under which we can actually succeed in achieving our Paris goal, imposing economic sanctions. The first one is the sanctions should be multilateral, international. Instead of taking alone, we have to work together with other countries. And the second one, instead of targeting the overall economy, we have to target selective groups of people who's supposed to be essential for political leadership. So in these two accounts, actually we are doing a good job in that sense. So I will talk more on this later. But the third condition is about we have to have a less ambitious Paris goal. When impose sanctions, we are making demand to Russia to take action. But if our demand is too ambitious so that Russia cannot take, then sanction wouldn't work. Russia wouldn't cooperate and refuse. So the question is, what kind of goal, demand we can make to Russia? That's an issue. In this sense, I'm pessimistic about success of this economic sanctions. The last one is about the sanction bursting behavior. Is there any country try to burst our sanction effort? In this sense, we have to talk about China. China and some of the countries, as you may remember, a few days ago, UN Council tried to pass resolutions. But there are one country, Russia, of course, used his veto power. And then three countries took up sanctions against, actually, virtually against the idea of passing resolution in UN Council. One of them is China and India and UAE. So definitely there are some sanction busting behavior in some places in the world. So this is pessimistic in terms of its factors, in terms of our success in drawing cooperation from Russia. So let me go over some of the numbers
After this, we'll go to the next one.
Okay, I will try to talk briefly. So in terms of our effort, of course, it's not only US, but a lot of countries. It's bigger than before because now, in the past, like Italy, Greece, or South Korea, Taiwan, they hesitate to join our effort in 2014. But now, almost all countries try to participate in these sanctions, multilateral, global participation. So in that sense, it's much bigger. Second, in terms of our damages to the national economy and the key players in Russia, actually, our size, because what like we did last time, we impose sanctions on their key, the banks, and a lot of international banks also cooperating with the U.S. by freezing their account, like including Switzerland account. Russian people, like including Putin, are supposed to have like $1.3 billion in their account in Switzerland. They're all frozen. And also, we have also imposed restrictions on virtual coin transactions. And most importantly, this is different from before. Now we're imposing sanctions on SWIFT systems. So Russia, so there are more than 11,000 Indonesian financial institutions participating in this SWIFT system, through which now they can send and receive money. If they are buying and selling some things, then they have to go through these systems. Now, several the Russian banks are now allowed to join these systems. We have some example in the past, like 2012 Iran case. We imposed similar sanctions in Iran, and later on it was reported that Iran lost about 30% of their trade because of sanctioning these SWIFT systems. So if the similar things happen, we are talking about 30% reduction of their trade in Russia. So it's going to be very effective. Also, there are other things, but because of limited time,
Yeah, maybe during question and answer.
Yeah, during the questions.
Yeah,
the problem is the negative thing. I already talked about their negative things. So we cannot demand too much to Russia and their sanction busting behavior. So in that sense, it's kind of mixed feeling we can draw from these current situations. I will talk more in detail if you have any questions. Thank you.
Thank you.
So as Russia began its bombings and invasion of Ukraine, there was an immediate stream of disinformation and misinformation that was coming across various social media channels, as well as the pro-Kremlin news media. For example, television network RT. Oh, am I just too?
Yeah.
Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Thank you. Sorry. I don't project very well, so excuse me. So, for example, the television network RT, formerly called Russia Today, repeated the false narratives that were being disseminated by the Kremlin, including the claims of genocide taking place in the Donbas region of Ukraine. That's the region controlled by the separatists, pro-Russian separatists. RT newscasters also used Putin's description of the invasion as being, quote, a special military operation. So the Kremlin's framing of the Russia's attack on Ukraine were and continue to be amplified by RT, although since its inception, RT always has presented itself as an objective news organization that's an alternative to Western media news. So I should point out, though, that European countries now are blocking RT, as well as the Russian state-sponsored news outlet Sputnik. And also Google has blocked the downloading of the RT app in Ukraine. You might have also heard that Meta has also blocked RT and Sputnik from both Facebook and Instagram, and then TikTok has followed suit as well. In terms of social media, widespread disinformation has also been found. It continues. For instance, on the social media app Telegram, which is widely used in Eastern Europe, the pro-Russian Telegram channel, for example, Intel Slava, there are several actually, started to share photos and videos in real time in different languages with fabricated narratives attached to those images and video. And so the problem is that unlike Twitter, Facebook, and YouTube, Telegram does not have any policy or restrictions on spreading false information or state-sponsored propaganda. And also, the pro-Kremlin channels are presenting themselves as open source intelligence. So they're trying to present themselves as being legitimate. And unfortunately, the information spread on Telegram through these channels have also been picked up by users of other social media platforms. The amount of disinformation found via Telegram's channels about Russia's invasion has been so large that the Ukrainian government actually flagged the channels as dangerous and have labeled them as information terrorism. I can't say for sure whether all of this is being orchestrated by the Kremlin, but because the narratives have been repeated over and over, and that the immediate messaging came out immediately across various different platforms and news media. It does appear that the Kremlin orchestrated very much a media campaign as well, a propaganda media campaign. And just to give you a bit of historical background in terms of the Kremlin's aggressive use of traditional and social media's forms of social power to achieve its hard power objectives, this all began when Putin first came into power in the early 2000s. Under his leadership, the Russian government has made huge financial investments in traditional and digital media. In the post-Soviet states, Russian-speaking populations have been the main targets of Kremlin's propaganda messaging that really has been anti-Western in nature. The propaganda has tapped into the post-Soviet nostalgia that Krista had earlier mentioned and has emphasized the historical and cultural affinities between the countries. After the annexation of Crimea by Russia in 2014, Putin actually presented Russia as having what he believed to be a moral and historical right to broaden its dominance in Ukraine and other FSU countries. And there are indications that the Kremlin's propaganda and disinformation that is being disseminated by the media entities are actually impacting the thoughts and behaviors of the Russian-speaking populations in the former Soviet Union countries. Together with my colleagues, I'm doing a study that looks at disinformation, misinformation, and propaganda targeting Russian-speaking populations in Belarus, Ukraine, and Georgia. And what we've found is actually, it's a survey-based study, so we can't say for sure if there's any sort of causality, but what we have found is that I'll give you an example, I'll just focus on Ukraine, those Russian-speaking populations who rely on pro-media news outlets have expressed this interest that Russia serves Ukraine in a positive manner, that Ukraine benefits from Russia. But if you looked at those individuals, Russian-speaking populations in Ukraine that rely on the Ukrainian media, they say the opposite. In fact, they express this interest in joining NATO and becoming part of the European Union. So it's very interesting. Again, we can't say if there's a causality there, but there seems to be a relationship. And I should point out that the Russian-speaking populations that we've surveyed are not the individuals living in Crimea or the Donbas region. So you're talking about, individuals living in other parts of Ukraine. Of course, the same time that the Kremlin is spreading disinformation and the Ukrainian government, President Zelensky, and also the public have been sharing information about what's happening on the ground. And also, of course, you've seen, pleas to the rest of the world to help Ukraine. And so truly what is happening in cyberspace is an information war going on. You're seeing different types of messages taking place and clashing messages taking place. So I'll leave it at that.
Great, thank you.
Okay, so modern Russia is an economy dominated by energy and natural resource exports. So 40% of Russian exports are of petroleum products specifically, drilled from the Caucasus region or in Central Asia. Another 20% are energy products in general, such as coal. And then their remaining exports are dominated by mined metals, chemicals, and agricultural products. So although Russia is a middle-income country, they are a very important player in global energy markets. And so naturally, with this invasion of Ukraine and with all of these sanctions on Russia, there has been a lot of disruption in global energy markets, or a lot of at least worry about disruption in global energy markets. And so this is a rapidly changing situation. Hopefully my information from about an hour ago is still up to date, no guarantees. But that uncertainty itself can also have an effect on the market. So what we've seen so far with these sanctions is sanctions against Russia have been quite strict. They've been separated from international electronic payment systems, and there have been sanctions against their central bank's ability to trade in foreign currencies. But with all of those sanctions, there have been carve-outs for energy-related payments. So the oil and the gas is still currently flowing from Russia, but even so, we're already seeing big effects on world energy markets. So just to benchmark the effects so far, European natural gas prices have risen by 70% since before the invasion began. That's more than doubled. And that's just due to the fear that natural gas might be cut off in the future. So Russian supplies of natural gas actually have yet to be cut off. They flow to Europe through pipelines that pass through the Ukraine and Poland and through the Baltic Sea. And even those pipelines which flow from Russia to Europe through the Ukraine are still flowing natural gas. Even while Ukraine is in the middle of a war, Russia is still sending their natural gas through it. And so that gives you an idea of the importance of these energy markets in Europe and in the US. And the best way for me to talk about Russia's energy exports is to kind of break down the effects between what is happening in Europe, local to Russia, and then I'll talk a little bit about what effects you can expect to see in the United States. So Europe is a huge importer of Russian natural gas. Natural gas is really a regional market. Gas has to be pressurized to be transported, so that means transporting it through pressurized pipelines, which are thousands of miles long and have to be built far in advance of any gas transportation. Or that means liquefying the natural gas and storing it in pressurized tanks so it can be transported, which is much more expensive. So Europe is very reliant on this Russian gas. That's just for electricity generation and for home heating. And you might wonder, why has this natural gas been exempted from these sanctions? Well, frankly, just because Germany and Poland and Northern Europe are very cold countries, and they rely on that gas for home heating and electricity. And so you can imagine it would have terrible effects on their countries if that gas were to be cut off. So even with these strict sanctions, we're signaling to them, or to Russia, that their energy is so important that we can't really cut off those purchases. Part of that, it's due to the cold. Part of it is also due to Germany has been closing nuclear plants recently. There's been a lot of environmental activism in Germany around closing nuclear plants since the Fukushima disaster in 2012. And what that has done is it's made them more reliant on coal and much more reliant on Russian natural gas. So even though their prices for natural gas have gone up 70% in the short term, there are really no good short-term alternative options for Europe other than to continue buying Russian natural gas. So they're facing a political trade-off between punishing Russia for this invasion by cutting off their natural gas markets, or between keeping the lights on and keeping the heat on. And so far, they've chosen to keep the heat on. In the longer term, Germany and Northern Europe, they do have some more options regarding energy. Again, liquefied natural gas is an option because that natural gas can be produced in places like the United States and Canada, and then liquefied and transported on ships. But it's going to take some time to ramp up that level of capacity to supply Europe's entire energy needs. And that just can't happen in the scale of a few weeks. And so I know we've reached a point where we're reading about this war online and information is moving at the speed of light, but oil and natural gas still moves at the speed of boats, which is much slower. So in the long run, they can focus more on liquefied natural gas exports from the United States or Canada. And we should see some at least temporary alleviation of the problem going into summer, because Europe doesn't have as much heating needs in the summer, so Russia won't be able to leverage them as much with their natural gas exports. So luckily in the United States, we're not connected to the European natural gas pipeline network. The US is a big domestic producer of oil and natural gas from places like Texas, North Dakota, and Montana, and the Marcellus Shale in Pennsylvania and Ohio. And we're also neighboring a couple of other big oil and natural gas exporters. So Canada is actually the leading exporter of oil to the United States, and Mexico is a close second. And the US in general, we export more oil than we import. We are a tiny net exporter. That wasn't true 15 years ago, but with hydraulic fracturing in Texas and other places, that's become true. So while we're not connected to European natural gas, the unfortunate truth is that crude oil, which is used to make gasoline, is traded on world markets. And that's because you don't have to pressurize gasoline to transport it. You can just put it in barrels, put that in the hold of ships, and transport it anywhere in the world. So although Texas produces a lot of oil, if Asia or if Africa is willing to pay a certain price for that oil, then other buyers in the US are also going to have to pay that price. So these effects of uncertainty coming out of Russia are going to affect US markets, and they already have. So I think the number I cited, if I cited a number at the beginning of this talk, was that West Texas Intermediate crude has risen in price by 13% since before the invasion of Ukraine started last week. And that rise in local crude prices is going to result in an increase in local gasoline prices, which I'm sure many of you have already noticed. Gas prices, as far as I've seen, have gone up in the last week. So can we expect them to stay high, or will they go down again? So again, unfortunately, we can expect gas prices to stay high for some time. That's due to a couple reasons. One is because gasoline demand usually rises in the summer. And as gasoline demand rises due to people travel more in the summer, that causes gas prices to get higher. And so that effect is going to play out as the weather gets warmer. We'll see a trend towards higher gas prices. There's also what's called the rockets and feathers effect, which happens in gasoline pricing and in other markets. And what that is as a producer's costs rise, they tend to increase prices immediately. That's the rocket upwards. But then when producers' costs decline, they only reduce their consumer prices very slowly. That's the feather down. So we see a rocket of prices upwards and then a slow decline. So even if oil prices go back down, say the situation is resolved in a couple of weeks, we'll see an extended period of higher gas prices. So we can expect, at least in the short term, a period of higher gas prices. And there aren't many policy responses at the state or federal level to resolve that. The US does have a strategic petroleum reserve of hundreds of millions of barrels of crude oil, and we can release some of that supply to temporarily lower domestic gasoline prices. The Biden administration actually did that around Thanksgiving a little bit, just to reduce gasoline prices a little bit around the Thanksgiving holiday. But the effects of those interventions are very limited because eventually that strategic petroleum reserve is going to be empty. We don't want to empty it because, frankly, it's for emergencies, and whether this qualifies as an emergency is unclear. And then once the reserve is empty, it has to be refilled again. So while we might lower gas prices a little bit right now, when we refill the reserve, will just result in rising gas prices later. Another thing we could do is there are various federal and state gas taxes that could be temporarily repealed, for instance, to slightly lower gas prices. The federal gas tax is about 18 cents per gallon. We think most of that 18 cents is passed through to higher consumer prices. So if you consider 15 to 20 cents a significant price drop in gasoline, that's about the extent of the federal government's ability to temporarily lower gas prices. But again, that comes with the trade-off that those gas taxes go to funding highway repairs and road construction. And that budget is also going to have to come from elsewhere if we were to temporarily lower that federal gas tax. In the medium term, one thing that will resolve this situation is we have a lot of more costly suppliers of gasoline in, again, Texas, North Dakota, and Pennsylvania, Ohio. They drill for gasoline using a process called hydraulic fracturing, which is somewhat controversial due to its damage to the environment, but it does produce a lot of oil. Those producers are high cost, though, so if oil prices remain high, we'll see a lot of investment in drilling in those areas that'll put at least a ceiling on how high domestic oil prices can get and how high domestic gas prices can get. Okay. And then in the long run, you can think over a time scale of, say, 10 to 15 to 20 years, you can think if we're looking strategically about punishing Russia for their aggression, for instance, You can think of renewable energy or nuclear energy or battery storage and electric cars as a solution to kind of lower gasoline demand and lower Russia's leverage over world gas and natural gas and oil markets.
Great.
Hopefully that puts me in lower than 5 minutes.
Great. Thank you so much. Okay, at this point, we have people with microphones because we're recording. So even if you think you can lift your voice high, let's just please raise your hands. I think there's a gentleman here. And we also have questions online. We'll just go back and forth.
I'll just toss this out to anybody who wants it. Can you distinguish between the outlook and actions of Vladimir Putin in the 20-teens and the outlook and actions of Adolf Hitler in the 1930s? If so, how?
Yeah, I'll take that one first. That's a hard question, but yeah, people are certainly talking about that. You know, first of all, we should make clear that Vladimir Putin is not trying to do the extent of what Hitler did with the Holocaust and so forth. So that's totally unrelated. But I think what people are referring to is the annexation of what is now Czechoslovakia and so forth. So yeah, I mean, there are definitely similar patterns of aggression and territorial aggression in particular since 1945 with the creation of the United Nations Charter. It is illegal to to take territory by conquest. And so that's a similarity there, where previous to World War II, Hitler and other countries, frankly, took territory and kept it. And we haven't seen that very much in the post-World War period, but this is an example of that. Let's hear an online question.
Yes, so we have over 200 people viewing online, which is really exciting. And with that, quite a few questions. So to start, what do you see as the likelihood that this will be the undoing of Putin, given the protests that we are seeing in Russia and the growing pressure of economic sanctions, financial ruin of Russia, and his inner circle of oligarchs? Is there any chance he could be overthrown?
Anyone want to take? I'll take that one too. Yeah, it's possible. I mean, there are lots of protests in Russia, as the questioner mentioned. This is not a popular domestic decision in Russia. And the international community, of course, has turned away from Putin and Russia, not the people, but the leader and the government. You know, Putin has protected himself as a dictator very carefully. You may have seen pictures of him sitting 50 feet from his own advisors. He's very isolated as a leader. At this point, his supporters or his elite supporters, advisors, still very much protect him and support him. If they are suffering through sanctions, perhaps, enough that they are hurting, it's possible that one of them or several of them could decide to just stop what Putin's doing. But I think at this point, there's too much fear. He has built up a very strong, what we would call, a personalist dictatorship. It's all about him, and people just fall into place listening to him. So yes, he could be overthrown, but the chances right now are very low.
I would add to that also the problem is that a lot of the information that is being disseminated in Russia comes very much from Kremlin kind of fed mechanisms. So all of the state media, that the large percentage of the Russian population rely on television for their news and information, and that is now all being controlled really by the Kremlin. Putin made this systematic. I mean, he has built this up. I mean, he has an end goal in mind. And so that is a problem. So I think that Krista's right. If you hit them in their pockets, the oligarchs, they're going to take action. But it's another matter also because you do see images of protesters. But, is that the vast majority of individuals living in Russia? And so that is a question because if you look at the Levada Center and their surveys that they're based in Russia, there's still a large percentage of Russians who think that invading of Ukraine is right because they want to bring, as they think, their brothers back into Russia.
If I add to it, in the past, Putin's popularity in Russia has increased whenever he attacked Georgia or the Crimea from 60 to 80, like Georgia case up to 88%. But last week, when he invaded Ukraine, his popularity went up from 60 to 69%. So unfortunately, it's very unlikely to happen, but it's possible because according to other studies, actually, economic sanction can generate destabilizing effect. People can go to street and anti-government protesting is possible, but sanctions should be designed to target those key people only, not people, the lay people. Then they're blaming shipping instead of targeting their own leaders. They actually target to U.S. or the Western countries. So we gotta be careful, selectively choosing our target and control the media information flow.
This one is more directed towards Dr. Wonjae. You mentioned for a bit that this sanctions might drive Russia closer to China. How real of a threat is this going to be? I mean, it seems to me like such a coalition would be quite bad on the international stage for the rest of us.
The U.S., Russia and China has maintained very rivalry relationship during the Cold War, as you know. But after the end of the Cold War, they feel like they have to work together. They used to have a regional conflict, a territorial dispute, but resolve it peacefully. And then China actually, I guess to China, this case is kind of experimental case for them when they actually attack Taiwan. So actually, I think carefully watching how others dealing with Russia and Russia react, and they have every reason to support Russia so that in the future, when they take action toward Taiwan, maybe engage in a conflict with the U.S., Russia can back up China. And practically, China is buying a lot of these energy sources from Russia. Russia cannot export. The price will go up in the U.S. and other countries, but the sales price will drop because nobody's going to buy the Russian gas and the oil. So actually, after 2014, the sales price dropped because nobody's going to buy. But if China stepped in and tried to buy, then things can change and they can find money to support their people.
An ongoing question, and then we'll go.
So it was mentioned that U.S. sanctions, while strong, are not effective in preventing Russia from continuing their invasion. Are there more effective nonviolent strategies the U.S. can implement to help Ukraine, or is sending troops to Ukraine our only effective option to help in de-escalating the conflict?
Well, after economic sanctions, there are some discussions about the relation between economic sanctions and military options. In the past, most countries actually, not all, but most countries utilize, after the sanction failed, they utilize military options. But in this case, we are talking about Russia. Sanctions are likely to fail because Russia is a big economy, they have resources, and they have a lot of cashes. We are freezing their banks, but they are holding a lot of the cashes, like $640 billion in cash. They can easily supply those money to any people need in the military and sanctions. Also, their debt to GDP size is only 20%. Ours is 34% because COVID-19. So this is a kind of chicken game. This is a lose-lose game. Both sides will lose. But who has more resources to survive, to keep fighting? I guess it's Russia, maybe. So sanctions may not work, appreciating, but maybe in terms of diplomatic, other options, military options, we have to definitely signal Russia that this is on the table. We cannot remove, we cannot say that it's not on the table. We have to say that this is on the table, although we don't want to use it. But to me, international public opinions, the anti-global condemnations on Russia, especially targeting Putin, could be really important at this stage. And even the US citizens have to unite it and demand our Biden administration to take more aggressive action, including even the military option, although actually we don't want to use it, so that Putin can get information that almost all countries, even people, are against his actions. Then maybe he can back down.
And that's often referred to as soft power, this nonviolent. So when we're talking about the reputation of Russia, it's obviously becoming known as a pariah, what we call a pariah state, much like North Korea. The difference is that North Korea was already isolated and has been for many decades. Russia is very much integrated into the international economy and policy, and it's a European country, which means that the international reputation of Russia matters a lot. And so now the damage that Putin is doing to his country, himself in particular, and the reputation of Russia will have consequences. So I think it's only been 6 days now, but already you can see massive amounts of a very strongly worded condemnation of Putin himself, as well as Russia and their military, not just the sanctions. So I think the combination of the sanctions and the condemnation itself and the sanctions are really strong. Now, whether we go militarily, that the United States, some say Biden should not have said that the U.S. military will not engage before the conflict. That wouldn't have mattered even if he said it did, because Putin would have invaded anyway. But there's no way that the U.S. will get involved in this conflict. And the reason, there are a couple of reasons. The first is Russia is a nuclear power, nuclear weapons country. The United States is too. We never have fought a war against Russia since 1944. So they both got nuclear weapons. Mutual assured destruction is a major concern. We don't want to go that far. Putin has already talked about putting nuclear weapons on high alert. I think that's more rhetoric than we're actually, just to clarify, both countries are always on high alert, so that doesn't really mean anything for a lot. It's just a scare tactic. So, but the U.S. will not engage militarily with Russia. That's not an option. What the U.S. can do militarily on top of the sanctions and condemnation is supporting the Ukrainian military, much like the other European countries, other NATO members. States are contributing weapons and tanks and artillery and so forth. So I think that's really where that combined package of the response is the best way to respond to the conflict. I think there's a question up there.
Thank you. I believe this is for Dr. Tim. You spoke about the effects that the Ukrainian activities is having on domestic oil and gas prices. Will you take that back 13 months and come at it from another direction with regard to the thesis that America's national energy policy has had the effect of escalating the cost of oil across the entire world, and it is now producing a significant revenue stream to support Putin's invasion of Ukraine?
So, as far as the ability of U.S. policy to affect world oil prices, it's fairly limited. And that's because a lot of U.S. oil suppliers are fairly high cost. The frackers in Texas tend to drill when oil prices are already quite high. The same for the tar sands oil in Canada, which is it's usually under forest and it's in sand, so it has to be pumped out using high pressure water and a lot of chemical processes that a traditional oil well wouldn't have to use. The world oil price is largely determined by a cartel of countries that are called OPEC Plus, and that's the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries, which largely includes Saudi Arabia, the other Gulf states, and Venezuela, and the plus in OPEC Plus is actually Russia. So what happened when COVID hit, there was a big decline in demand for gasoline because people were traveling less. And so a lot of those frackers and those high-cost producers in Texas and Canada and North Dakota stopped drilling and stopped investing in new wells. And so once they shut down, when people started coming out of COVID and demand started increasing, what happened is OPEC didn't increase their production as much as they had before the pandemic. So around 2014 or so, OPEC got into a price war or a production war with US and Canadian oil frackers, where they radically increased production from Saudi Arabia and Russia just to make sure that Texas frackers weren't very profitable. Now that all those frackers have kind of gone out of business, or a lot of them have gone out of business, OPEC has curtailed production, which has made world oil prices go up quite a bit. And in fact, getting OPEC to raise production would require probably cooperation from one, Russia, who's not going to cooperate with us right now, and two, Saudi Arabia, who I think views this whole situation as irrelevant to them and probably a great profit-making opportunity. So in the short run, I don't think there's much effect of domestic energy policy in the United States on those world oil markets.
Let's get an online question and then we'll get another.
So arguably, we face challenges of fallout from the Afghanistan withdrawal and our current foreign policy stances. These challenges seem to be eroding our allies and partners' confidence in our security assurances, both nuclear and conventional. What prudent steps should the Biden administration take to reassure our allies and starve off nuclear gamesmanship? This individual cites some examples like how Belarus is looking toward nuclear weapons, as well as how Iran and North Korea continue to seek nuclear weapons. And then furthermore, how do we encourage the UN and NATO to engage in these efforts to a degree of consequence?
So I think the first thing to point out is, there are obviously major differences between the Trump administration and the Biden administration, domestically and from a foreign policy perspective. With regard to that, the Trump administration was really leaning toward a unilateral U.S. approach to foreign policy, where Biden has taken a multilateral approach, meaning working with allies much in increasing confidence in relationships and also to the dismay of people who prefer U.S. unilateralism, depending on that cooperation. So as Wonjae talked about with sanctions, they can only work when you're working with other countries. So in the same sense, it's very important for the U.S., for the Biden administration right now, to ensure, particularly NATO allies, but also allies around the world, as well as what we call strategic partners like Taiwan, which Wonjae mentioned, because this is, the Biden administration just today sent very high-ranking visitors to Taiwan as a signal to China to watch out and to not think about invading Taiwan after this incident. So I think there's a multi-layered, multilateral approach that the Biden administration has to take. The downside of that is that, as I said, the U.S. has to work with other countries and cannot necessarily signal this superpower unilateral approach that the Trump administration really tried to pursue. So that's a short answer. I could go on, but I want to give more time for other questions.
So, as far as the influx of refugees coming from Ukraine, what is the attitude of surrounding countries towards taking in these current refugees, and also the criticism towards their more, how would you say, I guess, eagerness or willingness to take in these refugees versus Syrian refugees who sought asylum some years ago, and why might that be happening, and how do we respond to the complaints of non-white refugees fleeing from Ukraine being held at the Polish border?
That certainly is an area that needs to be further explored. The argument that they're making right now is that, Ukraine is right there, part of Europe. And so the notion that they should accept these individuals who essentially are part of Europe, it's almost like, Canadians coming into the United States. That's the argument that they're making. But I think it certainly does need to be dissected further, because that's an important question, actually, and whether racism comes into play, ethnicity comes into play, and whether you're willing or not to accept people. But at this point in time, I think that what they're saying is that we just need to help them, and we're in Europe. I mean, they're part of Europe.
If Putin refused to take any capability off the table and decided to challenge NATO in a limited fashion, say violate the sovereignty of the Baltic states. What's your confidence that we would live up to our Article 5 obligations?
100%. Absolutely, 100%. So, Article 5 does, it will be invoked even if 1 inch of territory is attacked by a foreign enemy. That does not mean we go to war, but it means there is limited response to a Russian attack, for example, on parts of Poland. There are concerns about Poland in particular, and other Eastern European countries. That may happen, but I think Putin underestimated the resolve of the people in Ukraine and the military capabilities in Ukraine. So if it had been a very fast, successful mission to take Kyiv, within a day or two, I think we could have seen a little further push further west. But since it's not going very well in Ukraine, I can't imagine that he would try something like that. But anything is possible.
You said not to make a statement. May I start with a statement and ask for comments? I'm thinking, whose idea was it to invite Georgia and Ukraine to join NATO? Who started this? I can't think of a better way to put a stick in the Russians' eye. I mean, why don't they invite Mexico to join the Warsaw Pact? What would we do then? I just can't imagine whose idea this was.
I mean, very briefly, this is it's not necessarily about the alliance. It is very much about keeping Ukraine pro-Western, and NATO was the way to do it. So yeah, I mean, absolutely, you're right. It stuck Russia in the eye for sure. I think we're almost out of time, but I think do we have another online question?
So how do the oil pipelines play into the scuffle between Russia and Ukraine?
So as far as the oil pipelines, there was until just a few days ago actually, a new pipeline plan called Nord Stream 2, which would have supplied natural gas to Germany directly through the Baltic Sea and would have bypassed Russian pipelines through the Ukraine. Okay, I'm not sure if my mic is working here, but I'm getting some signals that maybe it is. So to an extent, they played a role. Ukraine, the government of Ukraine gets transit fees for for natural gas that transits from Russia through the Ukraine to Europe. And so Ukraine really wants to protect those transit fees. And then that Nord Stream 2 pipeline would, by bypassing Ukraine, really cut into the Ukrainian government's revenue. That being said, I don't know that those pipelines specifically were a big motivator for Russia to invade, because I think, as Krista has gone into, there are kind of bigger forces at play for Putin than the transit of natural gas, even though the transit of natural gas is so important for Russia's state revenue.
Yeah, and Germany had already decided that there was going to be a Nord Stream 2. It was actually Putin's, Russia's invasion of Ukraine that stopped that. So, I mean, Putin hurt that effort altogether. And I want to reinforce Krista's notion that, all of this is really to kind of broaden the sphere of influence of Russia, because at this point in time, they're also doing similar actions in terms of disinformation, misinformation in Central European countries as well. So they're not stopping just with Ukraine. I mean, this has been building up. I would think the end game is actually to negotiate. I think they want the southern part of Ukraine. They're going to put in the puppet regime there, but also keep southern part. I mean, that's what I think will happen.
Mm-hmm. So I think we're out of time, unfortunately. I think a few of us might be able to stick around if you have further questions. I do want to also mention, I forgot to mention a couple, if you're interested in this topic, on Thursday, the Department of History and Modern Foreign Languages and Literature we'll have a teach-in from 10:30 to 12 to talk about the history and the cultural issues. That's going to be at the Student Plaza near the pedestrian bridge, Student Union Plaza. And on May 2nd, which is way in the future, but still very important date, we have a very important person coming, the former ambassador to Ukraine, whose name might ring a bell, Maria Yovanovitch, who was involved in the who was fired by Trump and the whole impeachment hearing issue. So if you don't recall that, go read about that because that was a pretty big deal and interfered a lot in U.S. politics. So she will be coming here to speak at the Baker Center on May 2nd. So thank you all very much for joining us. Thank you for those online, and have a great night. Thank you.
Classy.
Interesting.
Yeah. It's kind of,
Is that your realm of research too?
yeah, it is. It's electricity and natural gas.
Yeah. It'll be interesting to see how it all plays out.
Yeah,
too. I mean,
it's it was a bit depressing listening to your talk about their propaganda. It was
yeah, it's